Yeah, uh, this is the session number 7, week 7, and as you may remember, we started talking about um, last week we started focusing on the second assignment, which draws heavily on chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the book, as much as it's needed. Of course, there is more into them. And for the sake of recording this year, before we start recording, we were talking about the size in terms of the word limits for the second assignment. And yes, for each question, we're required to put 500 to 600 words. Yeah, you can strive towards having a kind of a balance in terms of the distribution of the words across the paragraphs in the first question that I tried to give you some hints about how to structure it in 4, 5, or 6 paragraphs. The first paragraph being just maybe a couple of sentences as an introduction. We don't want to spend too much of the space because it's very limited. No referencing for that. And yeah, I would just write as much as I can, and then I'll try to cut words in the end, and again, strive towards having a kind of a evenly distributed number of words across the paragraphs. But if I guess some paragraphs might be become a little bit larger than the other ones. It's hard to be very precise. So yes, the polishing, just leave the polishing, most of the polishing in the end. And again, the very first paragraph that is an introduction can be written later, in the end, when you've got that overview. For the second assignment, for the second question, we'll get there. So the focus today is to how to answer the second question. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to come up with any kind of a very neatly articulated instructions like in the first question for this one. So, but it has its own elements. So if we address the elements of it, we will be fine. And I'll get to that. Again, 500 to 600 words goes in there. Yeah, you can go about 10%. I don't care, even 20% above or below 600. That's okay for me. You're not going to be penalized for that 10%, 20%, whatever. Fortunately, the number in this courses is not that big that that extra 10% or 20% would cost me too many hours. So that's okay. Yes, and referencing for this one, because it requires us to mention some examples. Yeah, we need, because I mean the book doesn't have examples, that many examples. And we would like to, refer very briefly to just mentioning some names, like what I have done in my slides. But you, of course, you need a kind of a background knowledge. You need to Google and find that case and make yourself familiar. And then you say, okay, this case, for instance, shows how commonization or recommonization or decommonization or reification or fetishization happens. Okay, and that's it. I mean, you don't need to expand too much into that. Just mentioning that how that case is relevant to this, to your argument, that should be more than enough. But on the background, yeah, you need to know what the case is. For instance, the Zapatista movement, I keep forgetting the name of it, the New Zealand river rights movement, or etc., etc. Yeah, so that would be reference, and the referencing doesn't count. So don't worry about the in-text referencing in terms of the word limits, and don't worry about the bibliography in the end or the list of references. You don't need to include that in your word count. Um, count. Okay. Yes. Uh, yeah, let's then start the discussion. Just to refresh our memories, you may remember these graphs we discussed. I'm not going to get into the details of them again. The recording of the session is there. It's part of that modular perception of capital or capitalism that we have developed in chapter 4 based on the meta-theoretical backing in chapter 3. And as you can see, it's modular because it breaks down the system into different components. You can see how these components are related to one another. So you can analyze that. Analyze mean breaking down things to its elements, a system or a whole into its parts, and then synthesize, and then come back and see how these elements are interacting with each other, and then get back to the whole again. So analyze, you break it down into the components, synthesize, you put those components back together, how they're functioning and how they're interrelated and how they are interacting with each other, etc., etc. Our assumption is that ideally speaking, we assume a state of living that is called commonism. Well, is that something that we are making up? Of course, I mean, partly not, partly yes. Partly not, because the elements of commoning has always been there, out there. Our ancestors mostly lived in commons, and their relationships were pretty regulated based on their relationship with the environment, and how they shared resources and they shared knowledge and shared experiences. Yeah, a lot of times they were going to war with each other. A lot of times maybe they were occupying each other's lands, etc., etc. But the dominant economic system, if you like, or the system of subsistence or livelihood, I hesitate to use economy when I looking back into the history, their livelihood system were very much intertwined, very much integrated, holistic, etc., etc. And those elements are still with us. In the household, we look after each other, we care for each other, we don't charge each other, we don't seek interest from each other, etc., etc. I mean, ideally speaking again, or semi-ideally speaking again, at the communal level, a lot of care happens. At the public sector level, a lot of services are made quite cheaply, or not very expensively, or sometimes even freely available, especially you live in a welfare state system, etc., etc. So those elements are still there, because if they're not there, it's not possible to live without care. And it creates a host for capitalism as we said, as a parasite. So the parasite is not in the interest of the parasite to kill the host. So, but parasites tries to externalize. That's called, even formally called legally, for externalities. For instance, a company comes and do a lot of activities and creates lots of environmental damages, and says, well, those environmental damages are the externalities. I'm not going to take them into account. And it's the government and the community's responsibility to look after that. And that can open up some opportunities for some people to build some kind of businesses or enterprises, sometimes private, sometimes cooperative, for instance, to recycle and make money out of recycling the waste that capitalism has left behind, right? So that kind of results in kind of in coexistence. So we've got two scenarios. In reality, they're very much intertwined. It's not like one is in one universe and the other one is in another universe. But when we do this kind of an ideal typical separation, it's for the sake of analysis. It's for its analytical kind of model. And we'll say, okay, well, in a communist state, these we using Aristotle's way of looking into causes or resources of value. We've got these four commoning sources of creativity, livability, conviviality, and alterity. The reason you see those arrows connecting, it was just to emphasize they're so entangled to with each other that their relationship is very organic. Very organic. That's why sometimes we were getting a little bit confused. Is that alterity, or is that commonality, or is that, sorry, conviviality? Sometimes the confusion is because it's so intertwined. It's hard to separate. For instance, when we talk about creativity, we say human creativity, but then we realize it's not just limited to humans. Also, the other living beings also are creative. Even water is, you can attribute creativity to water because water creates things, has impact on the environment, etc., has kind of some sort of agency. Other, you can attribute to spiritual agency like the indigenous, which is not totally baseless in the physics. Some of those agencies that indigenous were attributing, for instance, to herbs they were using for healing. They were thinking that the spirits or the ancestors are involved in that, and they were attributing agency to the herb. But that herb had practically, if you study it, there are actually medical anthropologists that they study those things, and they say, well, actually, it was working. It had some antibacterial, for instance, properties, and etc. So. But you cannot really separate human creativity from that. And also, humans are not separate from the nature. So again, you can't say, well, humans are the creative part and nature is the livability part. Well, humans were part of nature. Humans have human nature. Nature has humans, and they're very, very much part of each other. So again, that separation is problematic if you look at it so organically intertwined. Conviviality, the solidarity inside the group. Again, it extends beyond those communities, indigenous community. They're very much in interaction with their environment. And okay, if I walk, it turns on. I should keep walking, I guess. So yeah, I mean, this is so organically intertwined. And what happens under capitalism? The process of decommonization happens. You see, this commoning way of living gradually is being replaced with another form of or format of living, where actually there is no more of that, communal or commoning way of living. So each one of those elements, again, analytically speaking, turn into different ways of or different types of causes of. Now, instead of true value, we're talking about fetish value, and under capitalism, more specifically, capitalist value. So it becomes exploitative power relations. Marxists concentrate on that one, the exploitative power relations, a lot in their value theory. Outside the value theory, they also address other things, but inside their value theory, which is supposed to be the very core theory under Marxism, and it's all mostly concentrated on commodity production. Commodities doesn't need to be a good, it could also be services. It could be material, it could be immaterial. Marx talks about a teacher working in a private sector versus a teacher working outside for a public sector, for instance. So that exploitative power, you can relate it. You can say that this is the capitalist version of that creativity. So creativity is now converted into labor, for instance, under exploitative power relationships, and it's regulated and embedded into exploitative power relations. But you can also talk about exploiting nature, but more recently, we, instead of talking about exploitation of of nature, we talk about extractivism or extractionism, if you like. So this extractivist power, this relationship with nature. Again, nature is being separated. The concept of nature is kind of missing in old ages. You know, nature, labor, nature is an alienated form of livability. It's separated. So the relationship between those four causes of fetish value um, are very mechanical. They're not organic. And it really affects the way we look. It's so embedded. I mean, I've been constantly in fight with myself to cleanse my mind from the way this works. I mean, um, I've, I've been also interested in um, uh, studying community well-being, okay, or quality of life. And I've been looking into, I love maths and things like that, the statistics. So into how to measure quality of life at the community level, not individual. And then I was looking at the indexes that are already out there. You know, OECD countries have their own, Australia, every nation has their own ways of measuring, you know, human development index, etc., etc. And each one of them, you look at them, say there's an ecological well-being, economic well-being, social well-being, political well-being. You know, political well-being, how much people participate, for instance. Ecological well-being, how much pollution is out there. Um, Social well-being, the services, for instance. The economic well-being, how wealthy the society is, the GDP or other measures. You know, the Gini coefficient that measures inequality, etc., etc. So you see that compartmentalized way of looking at the society, as if society is there. It's divided between, it has different dimension in it, and then they calculate each one of those dimensions and then add them up again, and then they come up with a number, and then they compare and rank countries or societies. You know, Australia is number 3 or 4 or whatever, and they say, wow, if Australia is number 3 or 4 with all these problems we have, then what the hell it should be the life in the other countries. So this compartmentality is very much because of the type of the system we live in. Okay, I think that was our, yeah, okay, that was our question for the class, yes. And then we had this graph that was showing, you know, now in that process of, yeah, so if we can have decommonization, we should also be able to have recommonization. And it's not just about reversing everything back to indigenous lifestyle. There are so many ways of recommonizing that would that can actually go hand in hand or become feasible in the settings where people are living in the urban areas, for instance, in more complex ways of living. And it can be digital, it can be very modern. You know, it doesn't need to be, you know, as soon as you talk about recommonization, etc., you know, people would say, oh, well, you're going to take us back to the caves and to the jungles or things like that. uh you know, it's not like that. So on the commonization, if we get, you know, a microscope and look more deeply into the commonization process, the book argues that what happens is there are infra-processes involved. And as you can see, we said decommonization. That I mean, that's the one single word that you can use. If someone says, "What is capitalism?" You just explain it or define it in just one word. You can just simply say decommonization, and then you have to, of course, unfold and unpack that and tell them what you mean by decommonization. Well, the book's argument is that there are three infra-processes happening to make that decommonization possible. And it's the reification, fetishization, and appropriation. And maybe one of the problems I found in the book, some places and not other places, is that it implies as if everything should start from reification, then fetishization, then appropriation. But as I've been thinking more, especially for the sake of our discussions, I realize no, we're very much intertwined. That's why when we go through this slides, I'll show you later. It's hard to so a number of examples keep coming back. A number of arguments keep coming back as we move from reification to fetishization to appropriation. I mean, you can't reification enables appropriation, and appropriation enables in return reification. So intertwined. And that's through these, then capital is born. When capital is born, then capital goes to factory, and Mr. Marx can help us better understand how capital is put to work in order to exploit laborers and then extract value out of them. But the laborer or labor itself is the product of this process. I mean, Marx and Marxian perspective wouldn't tell you where the labor come from. I mean, they would say that, but they wouldn't embed it into their values. They would consider it as a precondition, a historical precondition, something like that. Yes, and that would be, that's why Marx himself is very clear. I mean, I'm just focusing on the inner working, on average, he says on the average ideal of capitalism. That's what I'm looking at. But we say, no, we need to go beyond that inner working of productive capital. We also need to look beyond and see how capital interacts with the rest of the society, environment, etc., etc. Or capital can go to financial markets. It doesn't need to go to the factory or the firm or whatever, or the workshop. It can go to the financial. It can go and buy land and make money out of renting it. It can find different forms. Again, we're expanding the scope. But then we also realize that this process on the top cannot sustain itself. Because if you just keep pressing the accelerator when you are driving, you will sooner or later hit someone or somewhere and cause a huge accident for yourself. The host has, the parasite has to always look after the host. Otherwise, you can't, as a parasite, you can't live on a dead host. So that's why those civilizing meta mechanisms come into play. Why not civilizing infra-processes? I was asking myself again, and I had a hard time remembering why I used the word meta mechanism instead of infra-process. But because they're mostly intervening things. When something is more intervening, we're better to use mechanism rather than process. Process is something that starts from a point and ends in another point, and it's a transitional thing. Although in this mechanism, of course, there are transitions, there are processes. So what are these civilizing meta mechanisms? Well, part of that is because of people resist. I mean, a worker wants to survive, right? And a worker fights for their rights. And communities also want to survive. They don't want to be fully exploited. And um, so they resist. So part of that civilizing mechanism is because of people's resistance. I was a union member, the committee member, and we were at a meeting talking about how we can strategize to push the management into kind of an agreement about something. I don't remember what was that exactly, but one of the members said, "But we are actually helping them to get civilized." It's instead of having a cohort of a staff who are overly exhausted, you can't really extract value out of an overly exhausted staff. Their solution to this is that you see you as a replaceable part, like in the machine. You're in a car, in your car, when a part is overly exhausted and it's broken, you throw it out and replace it with a fresh one. So for capitalism, as far as there is an army, a reserve army of underemployed or unemployed people waiting outside, you become more of a disposable component. So if you're ever overexhausted, who cares? Just kick you out. As you know, we keep measuring your performance. Your performance drops because you're overexhausted, and then we blame the victim and we say, "Well, you seem to be not performing that well anymore, and maybe we need to sit and revisit your contract." But then we have established the unions that try to resist, and they keep losing, of course, and they have become weaker and weaker, unfortunately. So this is a system that creates constant conflict between the host and the parasite. Parasite, on the one hand, wants to suck the blood out of the host as much as it can. On the other hand, is aware that it cannot go too far. And also, on the other hand, the host has become dependent on the parasite because the money is in the hand of parasite. You need the bloody wage at the end of the month or fortnight. And at the same time, you want to survive, you want to be able to come back to work tomorrow. And then this is a system that creates constant battle between the rulers and the ruled. And so part of this civilizing is because of those class struggles, is those struggles between the marginalized. It doesn't need to be completely defined in terms of the class. There's always a racial element to it. There's always a gender element to it. It's a quote attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, the German socialist Marxist woman, says that the woman in a working class, lower class, is a slave of another slave, double exploitation. And the woman in the upper class is a parasite of another parasite. So it's again double exploitation up there, or a hierarchy. So and she was feminist. So you see that this is the way that the system works. And there's also civilizing mechanism. Sometimes a lot of times comes from those parts of capitalist class that are a little bit more rational. They understand that they can't go too far. They want to sustain their own system. And they, like, the very historical obvious example of it, as always we say, it's Ford. Mr. Ford, who decided to increase the wages of his workers because he knew that the cars had to be bought by someone. I guess credit cards were not invented. If he knew about the credit cards, if the credit cards were there, he wouldn't bother with the wages. We say, okay, we'll give them credit cards, and so they can spend out of their future and the future of the children to buy those cards through rent, through interest, finances. Finances were not that big. But as soon as they became big, then they even the rational the rational capitalists stop being rational. So, well, okay, the credit cards are there. So sometimes these civilizing mechanisms get a form of progress, like taxes or tax incentives or subsidies or subsidy incentives. We put progressive tax, we curb and we limit, the amount of money they can accumulate, and the government redistributes that. The job of the government in a capitalist system is to think long term. So a bit of a long termism. A capitalist is a short termist. Capitalist wants to suck the blood to get the profit, to maximize the profit as short as possible in the time frame. Whereas the government, the capitalist government or regime or the state looks longer. Say, well, individually you want to maximize your profit, you too, but if together we do that, nothing will be left. So let's just slow down. And also we need to get elected back to the office. We don't want to see revolutions and uprisings and riots and etc. etc. So some of those become kind of progressive, and some of the civilizing mechanisms or meta mechanisms become regressive. For instance, Nazism or fascism or populism, far-right populism, Trumpism. You may have heard already that Trump has promised that if he wins, he will cut the taxes for corporations. With this means putting their feet on the accelerator, not the brake. The argument is that, well, it's always been there. Well, we cut the taxes for the super rich, and then they're the engines of the economy, and they produce more money, and then more money means more employment. So the wealth would trickle down for the poorer people, and then through creating more jobs, etc., etc. But has never happened. IMF report came back and said, sorry guys, neoliberalism sucks. We were wrong about trickle-down doctrine. It has always been trickle up. Yes, some in some periods, in some places, in some sectors, you see an increase in employment, but most of those employment are not that very secured one. A mining company goes, gets a license, a bigger license to dig larger places. They create a town, a number of people get employed. You come back 10 years, 20 years later, the mine is finished, those people are finished too. The town becomes a ghost town, deindustrialization, etc., etc. And then they become, when the liberal part, when the progressive part fails to deliver and civilize, and things gets ugly, then the regressive parts come up. And the regressive part, the far right would just put forces people into compliance. Okay, I'm talking too much. And then yes, this is the other side of it. And we can also think of recommonization or recommonizing infra-processes that happen here and there in many ways, in many different ways. No. Okay. Maybe I have to press one of these. Yes. And then yes. So part of it is just to recommonize and return and restore. And the other part is also or originally creating new commons or looking after the existing commons that are not being perverted yet, or enhancing them. So this is the other side of the coin. And yes, we had this table in chapter 4.1. Remember that reification, fetishization, appropriation, their definitions are a little bit different to the literature. So in case you're using AI to make sense of the chapter, you need to really train the AI that this is not, because the AI keeps drawing on the outside literature. You have to really say, no, 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 reification here means this, or fetishization means this, if you have extra time for that. So yeah, reification, as we remember, if you may remember, what was the definition we came up with? Yeah, reify means to thingify, to turn something that is not just an object to just an object, something that has meaning and subjectivity to just an object, to asset or a substance, and it's about objectification. And it's very much necessary for capitalism. Capitalism wants to commodify and exchange things in the market. Anything that even it's so immaterial. Human creativity is so immaterial, right? Human ideas and knowledge is so immaterial. Even that becomes so kind of objectified, and become like a commodity to be exchanged in the market. But capitalism doesn't need just to. The reason you don't see the word commodification here, as the chapter explains, is that capitalism doesn't need to commodify everything. For instance, women's reproductive labor, housework, right? The care work that happens at the household level or at the community level. It's not being exchanged in the market unless someone becomes a care worker employed by a company. We're not talking about that. But a lot of housework that we do, looking after each other, it's not commodified. You don't see it in the labor market, but it's the backing, because I mean the worker has to be reproduced, to be refreshed to come back to work, for instance, and also intergenerationally, when the working class has to reproduce itself into the next generation. So this reproduction is given to the public sector that educates our children, the care work that we do, a lot of care that we do through the household and through the household relations, communal relations, etc., etc. And they're not commodified. You don't sell or buy the activities you do in your community or at home. And also public education, also public maybe other public services that are subsidized. So that's why reification sometimes translates into commodifications, like the commodities that we produce, like the commodification of the labor that goes into the labor market, etc., etc. But doesn't need to be always in the form of commodification. And if you interact with AI keeps feeding you back with the commodification, because AI thinks that everything is done through commodification, because AI is trained by the existing literature that is not that deep enough. So you really need to, when you interact with AI, if you do, you need to tell AI, hey, there's something in that chapter that says, no, it's not everything is about commodification. That may commodify, or commercialize, or financialize. Okay, and then we said that when things become reified, become objectified, we humans, even the most atheist of us, if you talk to an atheist, they always deny anything spiritual. I'm using this with a bit of an example, with a bit of an exaggeration, of course. There could be pure atheists out there, but after a while, you see that, for instance, you go and live with them and interact with them and make friends with them, and you see that they still believe in some superstitious things. It's in the nature of our humanity to always attribute things to immaterial entities or things like that, or even if they don't do, they would still say we value honesty. Okay, we value honesty, but I mean, honesty is not very material. I mean, it needs to be that valuing honesty needs to be kind of I would say anchored on something beyond human relationships. Because if you just leave it to humans to define it through contracts with each other, whoever has the upper hand defines what honesty is, or what justice is. So we can't just say that is all. It's all a social contract. Anyway, so the point I was just trying to make is that when the system uh, uh, reduces human relationships and more than human relationships into objects, it's not going to work well. You still need to energize people spiritually, mentally, psychologically, incentivize them to dedicate themselves, to commit themselves to the system. So you replace the value that in a community, in an indigenous community, in a normal community, in a natural community, you attribute to the river or to the, I don't know, to the mountains and to the objects you make. You remove that meaning and significance and agency, but you still have to replace it with something, a new kind of value, a value that would elevate the importance of the commodity in your mind, in the mind of the people under capitalism. And that comes fetishization. So now you are taken off your communal relationships and ability to be freely creative, and you're brought into the to the firm or to the company or to the business as an employee. Now your work needs to be valued, but based on some kind of criteria. So if you are contributing to the profit that the company is making, then you're the best. So your work is very much, awarded and rewarded, whatever, and value. So now value is defined how efficient or effective that is stuff, or whether it's your labor, your intelligence, your knowledge, or whatever, is to the system. So the price tagging, right? The price that we put on something. And then later on, when, for instance, you think of land, for instance, land loses its ecological importance and value. Land, when it's become privatized, it loses its human and more than human and communal significance. And that significance now is replaced with another type of significance, which is what? Uh, you know, it becomes a symbol of wealth. The more land you have, it becomes a symbol of a prestigious symbol, maybe for some. Or it becomes a way that you can accumulate more capital without bothering yourself with the complexities of getting your hands dirty in manufacturing or production. You just buy, you take parts of the profit you made, put it into sorts of land, rent them out, or you just even leave them there because they keep growing because of the scarcity. The population grows and the scarcity for the land, and then of course they keep growing. If you buy lands, you think that you speculate that the urban area is going to be extended in that area. If I buy the cheap land there in 10 years, 20 years, it will become expensive. A lot of people make money like that, the rich ones. So you see that land finds its own value and significance. It becomes worthy of our worshiping, and any other object, any other thing that has become objectified needs to be again fetishized, to be valued and valorized, if you like. So That's a fetishization process. In a Marxian language, reification and fetishization are very much close. And sometimes you can't really distinguish. We're trying to separate them, so we're moving away from Marx in that sense. Sometimes when they talk about reification, they mean fetishization. When they talk about fetishization, they mean reification. And then we call number one and number two, when they go together, we call it abstraction. You abstract it paves the way for abstracting value. Now, appropriation is it comes as the third element, and it means it doesn't just mean that you take someone's stuff away from them. It's not just simply confiscation. It's also about control. It's also about, especially those hierarchical control. It's about coding that into the law. I mean, confiscation and taking someone's food or taking someone's stuff possibly has been around from the mythological time when Cain killed Abel, right? So it's been around, but under capitalism it finds its new form, its modern form, when then you not just seize but also, or enclose but also control and legalize it. You legalize it in a way that it becomes everybody, even the most exclude person, thinks that it's justified because it's coded into the law. Property rights or intellectual property rights. Things that's been ideas that have been around for many centuries, produced by communities. They become someone's property, patented or patented. So and then the ownership becomes justified. Again, you see, the reason that something becomes property, well, property means it has become reified, right? And when you add right to it, property right, that means it has become fetishized, right? Because you are not attributing right. I have right to have it, to own it. So that right aspect of it is the fetishization of it. So then you're attributing a fetishistic value to it, or attribute to it. And then it becomes totally justified. No one can touch it, and you can make money out of it. You can control it. You can have control over it. It doesn't need to be an object. It could be the way that you organize work, for instance. So yes, so these are the three infra-processes in infra. They're together. They're the underpinning of decommonization. That's why we call them infra-processes. We also talk about the civilizing meta mechanisms, but you don't need to address them for the second question. Okay, it's a negative loophole, feedback loop, etc., etc. It's just to, it's there. It helps the system to endure longer, but also helps the ones that are exploited by the system to survive longer. So it has it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword, and also has another function which normally we forget. It distracts us from a structural shift, a structural transformation. If it just puts some carbon tax and price on carbon, if it includes a little bit of a tax on the rich and then fund our schools, we normally think we're done, fine. Why we should go for a revolution? Well, we're doing well now, for now. So, well, yes, you make your life a little bit more comfortable for the disempowered a little bit, but also you prolong the life of a system that is highly full of it is full of contradictions and crisis prone. And when you do that, actually the system, in order to afford, it expands its tentacles to places that those regulations don't exist. So, for instance, when we came up with the unions, and unions became more a little bit too powerful for the super rich, then they started to think about something called globalization, right? So, well, if I'm under too much pressure here and I can't make trillions of dollars instead of, and I have ended up making billions of dollars instead of trillions of dollars. So why not going to China? Or why not going to Indonesia? Why not going to Africa? So, and over there's so many despots and tyrannical regimes that we can actually make friend behind the scenes with them. And then we can actually eat with each other, we can make money and then share some of that with those tyrants, and they will be more than happy because they don't have any the backing of their populations. They're ruling by the iron fist. So since they don't have internal legitimacy, they're very much dependent on external fundings and external finances. So let's give them a bit of finance, and they open up the gates for us, and we go and exploit their populations, and win-win for us and lose-lose for people. And then as the result of being able to fly overseas, then the unions here would weaken because they can't really negotiate on or over better wages, because if they do, they're going to lose their jobs because we're going to take our capital overseas. So they came up with this idea. So anyway, so you've got this kind of civilizing. So if you civilize capitalism at home, it becomes more wild and savage out there. So then you have to actually, as a working class, you have to sympathize with the more exploited working class in the global south and try to protest against their exploitation. If they are less exploited, then the capital has less incentive to go out there. So it has to stay here because everywhere it goes, it would be under pressure. That's why the so-called advanced democratic societies have, like the United States, Europe, they all have huge interest in keeping the despots in power. Either Saudi Arabia, the tyrants of Egypt, the tyrants of Southeast Asia, they love them, even if the rhetoric is against them. And they sometimes go into those international meetings, and they remind the tyrant that, well, there's something called international, human rights, etc., etc., and we expect you to look after your humans, your citizens. And then they say, yes, we'll do. But then the companies and corporations are in the business as usual. Okay, and the other side of the coin is just reversing everything, reclaiming as an opposite to appropriation, de-fetishizing as an opposite to fetishization, de-reification as opposite to de-reification. And it can also be originated. It doesn't need to be about only reversing things. So, you can invent new commons. You can invent new ways of living. You can invent, you can open up and find some place in order to have your eco village or things like that, or set up your cooperative that is based on peer-to-peer production and shared resources, etc., etc. So many ways. So it doesn't need to be all taking things back. You can always find ways of establishing new things. So these are the definitions, and that table captures all these key definitions. And then you remember that we had this one that was, it's a kind of a bit of a zoning here happening, Marx being, in terms of in his value theory, concentrating on inner organization of productive capital, mostly focusing on how labor is being exploited and value is being extracted, and results in profits and prices and etc., etc. But then we said it's not just labor, for Marxist nature, social reproductive relations and political organizations are very much background conditions. They don't get directly engaged with them in their theories, value theories. In other theories, in their political theories, oh yes, they would go very anti-colonial. They would go very much against the exploitation of women. There are many feminists are Marxists, many Marxists are feminists, but that's not in their theory. That's not how they would see. Well, that's a conditions of possibility, and make the exploitation of labor possible. And then, so if you expand that your value theory to include those, it's larger. It's larger than that rectangular, that oval thing. But still, it's capitalist relations. You're not including the non-capitalist relations, and you can't think that capitalism lives isolated from non-capitalism. If as we just argued, that capitalism is like a parasite to the non-capitalist relations, and it sucks their blood. So it has to pervert them, or decommonize or those four causes of true value into these four causes of fetish value. But those four causes of true value do exist, and they do result in true value. As soon as you spend just a half an hour looking after your sick brother or sister, well, you're doing true value, right? You set up an urban garden, owned and controlled and decided and planned by your community. You're producing true value. You live and exist before the invention of capitalism, or in a place that capitalism hasn't expanded its tentacles into. You're producing possibly, if people are kind of free and communal participation is quite equal, you're producing true value. But then this true value has a transforming impact on capitalism. It limits the power of capitalism to some extent, but it can also have civilizing impact on capitalism. Capitalism says, I don't care about these pieces of land. They're not making profit for me. Here it's yours. You come and take them and use them as a recycling place to recycle the stuff and the waste that I leave you with. And you can also make money out of it as a community, and think you think happily that you're contributing something positive. But it also helps me not to deal with the waste. So it can also have kind of a civilizing impact on the system. And there are also efforts in order to restore and take things back to true values, like the movement, indigenous movements, land rights movements. I don't know, any movement that tries things back from the capitalist system back to the communist system, not communist, communist. So you see, this is kind of universe we live in. Okay, the second question. I think I'm not sure if I have enough time, but I had some very interesting YouTubes to play, but they would possibly take about 30 minutes. And yeah, maybe let me walk you through this, because this helps you to answer the second question. The second question is about analyzing the infra-processes of decommonization and recommonization. We don't have a space for the civilizing ones. So just decommonization, recommonization. Discuss this process, transform true value, how these processes transform true value into fetish value, citing specific examples from contemporary socioeconomic studies. So we want to go through those three infra-processes, reification, fetishization, and appropriation, to explain the decommonization of something. Last week I talked about water, and then you can also see the slides there. Possibly this time when I was preparing for this, I was thinking of land, a little bit perhaps easier to understand than water, maybe. so the decommonization of land. So you see that this is um, and also recommonization. So when we decommonize land, um, again, we need to um, liberate our imagination from capitalism. And one of the easiest way to do that is just to look into where land is not is still a commons. It's commonly shared, you know, like the indigenous societies that are not yet modernized or incorporated into capitalism. And they again, you see that appropriation happens. You know, you can't just say, you know, reification happens first or whatever. But you know, the land gets, you know, enclosed and taken away from those communities in the name of, I don't know, drilling, development, modernization, urbanization, all sorts of excuses, become privatized, etc., etc. But in that process, under that process, you see that land that used to have kind of significance and meaning for the community. I mean, originally land is normally it's considered as a living entity. It's live. It's a life sustaining living entity in the communist state of living, and that becomes stripped away from it, and then it will be treated like a commodity, like a thing. And when it becomes a thing, then someone can own it, and then appropriation becomes possible. So that thingification is for the purpose of appropriation. Appropriation is facilitates or facilitates this thingification. And so the land that is part of the commons, the living entity, or you can say it's part of the commoning cause of livability. It becomes objectified, it becomes property, and then we fetishize it by attributing market values, so that ecological and communal values gone, right? It has become now an object. Now, but we still, as humans, as a system, we need to, as under capitalism, we need to attribute a value to it. If you don't attribute a new value to it, why people should bother themselves with this object? So now you attribute, you know, legal codes like, you know, the rights, you know, to property. You can attribute market value to it. You can put it into a speculative markets and speculate about its value in future. Is it worthy buying it or not buying it, or investing in it or not investing in it? Is it worthy to rent it out or not rent it out? So, and then it becomes fetishized. And then together with that, the appropriation is complete. You know, you own it, you control it, and you make value, capitalist value out of it. It can be incorporated into where Marxists love to think about. It can become a landed property for a factory, and then rent seeking, etc., etc. Or it can be just be part of a speculative market, or it can be part of the. It can become a way you can actually park your money in for I mean, you normally we're normally told that you can't just, you know, grow money, you know, you can't plant money to grow like a tree, but land actually is one of ways to do that. You buy it, and the value keeps growing. Capitalism makes, you know, the more capitalism appropriates and confiscates and turn things from communal to property, the more scarcity it creates. The more scarcity it creates, you end up having, yes, housing crisis, but also the housing crisis is a crisis for the people who don't own houses. But it's a wedding ceremony, it's a party, it's a happy time for those who own those houses and own those lands. So yes, so then you see that decommonization happens in this way, and then the recommonization is just to bringing that back into into a commons form, into communal form. In it can happen in different ways. Yeah, so and then the next slides keep moving across these three processes, like reification of the land, reified land, fetishization of land, and then appropriation of land. Then the other side of the coin would be recommonization, which again starts with, for the sake of argument, it starts with reclaiming, getting back the ownership and the ownership and control. But it's not about reclaiming here. Is not about, no, you took our community land. Now we're going to get it back. It's not just about returning ownership. It's also, as soon as you return it, you don't own it anymore. Your relationship becomes a stewardship. You look after, you become the custodians of the land in this case. So a stewardship becomes replaces ownership, because it's not property anymore. It's not object anymore. And your relationship would be very different to that land, that piece of land that has become reclaimed, because now you don't look at that land as a piece of property or object. You treat that land, as an indigenous people would say, as our relative. It's a motherland, mother nature. It belongs to mother nature. So our relationship with it's like our relationship with with our mothers, with our relatives. And then that land wouldn't be put into kind of a real estate market relationships anymore. So it would be more about, how to look after that land that is looking after us through its own natural ways of functioning. So so then reclaiming, and some examples here. I can maybe waste your time by asking you to go through this. I mean, it was my plan to do that I would ask you to look at these slides and try to make sense of them and see how you can incorporate them into your question. I think that you can do that at home, maybe, instead of here. And then if there is a problem, you can let me know. And then the de-fetishization is, again, de-fetishization is about, now, okay, we're not going to accept this, that this land's value is only determined by market. I'm not going to accept the fact that the value of my labor is only determined by how much I contribute to the profit of the company. So it would require a huge change, but it's now we're going to also attribute different types of value to the land that we have reclaimed. And again, it gets back to its original significance, the communal significance of the land, the ecological significance of the land. And then de-reification, again, it's very much embedded. Now the land is not just an object, it's not just a property. The relationship is based on the stewardship rather than ownership, etc., etc. And there are some examples, community land trust, the Cuban land reforms. They keep coming in the slides, because every time we're just talking about that aspect of it, reclaiming urban lots, in Detroit. You can Google each one of them and find about each one of them. You don't need to cite or refer to every one of them, just maybe a couple. So that these examples are there in this slide. So when you write your answer to the second question, you can Google and find the ways. The civilizing mechanisms, as I said, they're not part of your second question in the second assignment. But all very interesting. If you find extra time, you see that, you know, some of things that you think they're helping reclaiming and de-reifying or de-fetishizing. As I said before, any activity in that graph, if you may remember, any activity that is about restoring the commons, uh, it is a double-edged sword. It can be co-opted by the system, and the system says, well, that's okay. I'm fine with you guys doing that. I'm fine with you guys having that little patch of land dedicated to, I don't know, urban gardening and making even urban foods and things like that. But and run it communally. I'm fine if the legislations are changed to allow and even incentivize people to set up their cooperatives, etc., etc. But but I'll tolerate them as far as they're not a threat. As far as they do the jobs that I'm not interested in doing. They're not profit making. And by the way, you guys are non-for-profit, right? So I'll do the profit, you do the non-profit. And we can coexist with each other symbiotically. So, but you know, as soon as they become stronger and stronger, then the system starts to crush them. So this would require the people not to go fancy and delusional about their achievements, about their little niches or bubbles they have created successfully. This was picked up by Marx and Engels in their own time. They were looking at such cooperatives and they were praising them. They were praising them, but at the same time they called them utopian socialists. That they think that, you know, if you make you a new way of living that works much better than the existing one, then you make the existing one look obsolete. And this way, without a revolution, without putting pressure and without disobedience, you can actually change the system. And more people will join you. And one day you wake up and see, whoo, capitalism is gone. No, Marx and Engels says, no, just let's not go to delusional. It's great. Let's do it. We're not against it. Let's do it. We're not against it. Let's do it. But we also need to go revolutionary. We also need to challenge the system to its core. We also need to roll up our sleeves and get involved. You know, well, if it's too difficult to overthrow, just go and set up a new political party that is more serious in changing its structures and the system in the end. You know, Leninism. So, yeah, every option in the current condition that capitalism has huge upper hand and it has become more and more authoritarian should be on the table for the people, by the people. Otherwise, we're doomed. So yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little bit too polemic and political here, but it's the point here is just, yes, a lot of these good things are good and they should be done, but they are double-edged swords. They can coexist in a symbiotically way. That's the correct word. And then they therefore you need to have that external aspect of alterity, which was what you remember. Yes, to push for your agenda, to push back the system, to expand it, go and negotiate with the existing political parties, set up your new political party that would change the legislation to give upper hand to cooperatives, for instance, worker-owned cooperatives. Huge subsidy incentives, huge taxation incentives for everyone who can set up cooperatives that are owned by the workers and controlled by the workers. We're giving a lot, billions of dollars of subsidies to those giant corporations that are contributing significantly to climate change. But why not doing that to those who don't? Why not doing that to those who are owned by us? So we need to push. We need to become a force. The new generation, the millennials, yes, they have differences with the previous generation, but you'd also the new generations should look into the previous generations when they went revolutionary, 60s, 70s, early 20th century. The clock is ticking. Everything is not computer games. You can't win you can't win the real world by winning computer games. We need to get our heads out of the gadgets that capitalism has provided us and get serious. How many of us have ever uh, signed petitions that would seriously challenge, a monopoly like the gas industry here? And there's a petition around. Have you seen that? That's the minimum thing we can do. Just put our name in there. Just put our name on there. Or how many of us have attended the genocide protests, anti-genocide protests? Don't we have responsibility? I mean, is that, whatever happens somewhere in the world, the genocide and ecocide go hand in hand. The companies that are contributing to ecocide are the ones that are actually behind the genocide. The same imperialist powers are exactly the same one that are behind the ecocide. So we need to really get serious. The childhood, I'm sorry, is over. We need to really become politically. I mean, it was Aristotle 2,500 years ago. He said, humans are political animals. If you're not political enough, you're just an animal. I mean, I'm sorry to say that. I'm going to say it to myself, but that's based on Aristotelian perspective. And he was right. He didn't say humans are social animals. That would be more accurate, because yes, we are social, but ants are all social, but ants are not political, as much as we are. So what differentiates between humans is not that they are only social. I mean, microbes are social, but that's the fact that we are political animals. And many people try to understand, for instance, depression or anxiety psychologically. It's again bourgeois science. Yes, yes, a lot of psychological things going on. Maybe chemicals are not in balance, etc., etc. Maybe I have had childhood traumas. Who hasn't really? But a lot of the depression that we suffer from, when many of us are suffering, it becomes a sociological problem, not just a psychological problem. And when something is a sociological problem, then the cause is sociological and the solution is sociological. And when we become depressed, well, when you lose your agency, when you feel that you're not valued, and that is embedded from the childhood. You see it in everyone around you, and you get it. You absorb it into your body, into your mind, and then we become depressed. But that depression, psychological depression, that you keep blaming yourself when you see yourself in the mirror, and you go and see the psychologist, and the psychologist implies that it's only you, and the outside is raining, and all I can do as a psychologist for you to give you a umbrella to take to the rain, so you won't get wet. Well, it may work individually for you sometimes. The pill may work, and I'm not against that. Let's take the pill. But when many of us in that situation, especially our youth, that means the society is bloody sick. So we need to actually deal with that in some way. How gain our agency? The more we gain agency, the more we are creative, the more we feel we're alive. And that's, that creativity, human creativity in close connection with the environment. Even psychologists not talking about environment or nature therapy, because it regains a little bit of that connection. It regains a little bit of that agency. Anxiety. I've been myself personally been suffering from anxiety significantly. Panic attacks after panic attack. What's the anxiety? What's the source of anxiety? Fear. Where does the fear come? Everything is bloody uncertain. Everything is bloody uncertain. I can't plan for my tomorrow or next week, because every time the management comes up with new plans or new games, and every time they want us to do something to maximize the profit, maximize the revenue. The system creates sources of fear, sources of uncertainty. And then you sit and think carefully, to sit together. I mean, the problem, we always individualize our problems and psychologize our problems, because system has isolated us as the result of decommonization. As the result of decommonization, we're not talking with each other. If we talk with each other, we see that we're sharing a lot of our same concerns. same types of uncertainty. And then when we realize it, when we come together, the fear goes away because we are now much bigger. We are a collective. And so when you become more activist, people say, no, 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 don't tell my child to become activist. They become more anxious about the problem. Well, when you become activist and many other people have become activists, you are in a collective. You feel more certain. You feel more protected. The fear goes away. I mean, I'm not saying that 100%, but a lot goes away. Yeah, so sorry, again, I went to the footnotes. I'm talking footnotes. Yeah, anyway, so this is yeah, I mean, I was just telling you, these are not really abstract concepts. They're not just macro, they're also micro. They have impacts on individuals. Yeah, please go through these, and maybe we watch something that would be more attractive, and then give us some better ideas than just me talking or looking at those boring slides. Okay, this one is a TED talk, maybe 9 minutes. This one is a little bit longer, 21, and we don't have time for that. But please look at this one. This one talks about how actually that the legal codes turn land into property, and it goes historical, talks about the early land enclosures, but it also covers how land as a living entity becomes a property encoded into the law, and its ownership becomes legalized. It's interesting when that lady talks. She talks about when the peasants were taken, the land was taken away from the peasants in Europe, and they had to fight it in court, right? They sued the landlords, the ones who took the land away from them, and then the landlords sued them, and then they didn't, not educated enough, etc., etc. They're called commoners. The people who live on the common land, they're called commoners. So these commoners, so this battle, this legal battle, you see elements of fetishization. You see elements of reification. So that appropriation, that taking the land, was not possible before the mentalities, the understanding of the land changed through that legal system. And no, this is a property that needs to be owned, that needs to be, and then attributed in new ways of valuing them. So and then the rights is very kind of fetishistic term. So if you have the right, it's yours. And then the TED talk. So this is very interesting for the decommonization. You can see the elements of that. The TED talk is a lady, an indigenous lady, I think from the United States, and she talks about how they took the land back, and then they changed the way that the land was treated as the indigenous, and she makes a case that, especially to the mainstream dudes, that don't worry about when we talk about a return of land to the indigenous, we're not going to take your house away from you. You may remember when we had the voice referendum, tokenistic, I mean, but better than nothing. But a friend of mine was sending a message that if we give the voice to them, they would take our properties away from you. You won't own your house anymore. Things like that. The reason that you don't have your house deed is because of them. Whereas actually the house deed is in the hands of the government. Sorry, the bank until you pay back your mortgage. That's why you don't see it. So anyway, so it's a very interesting one. Maybe we watched a TED talk. This one is actually refers to a city in my home country, country of origin, Iran. The city's name is Yazd. It's in the middle of the desert, very, very hot. But for many, many centuries, they have built their houses. You see, this is called wind catcher, or bod gear. Bod means wind, and gear in Persian means catch. Uh, it catches the wind. Maybe we bought. The reason I share that here is that, you know, this is the knowledge about this. This is ancient aircon, works very well. If it has worked in the hottest places on earth, it should be working well, for many, many centuries. And the beauty of that is that it doesn't need any electricity or anything. If you come to my hometown, Isfahan, again, it's in the middle of, it's a beautiful city. It has a river in the middle. It has so many ancient monuments. One of them is a giant mosque built about 500 years ago. And one of the interesting places that you go in there is the architecture, because they didn't have electricity, they didn't have electrified megaphones for the speaker, for the priest, right? So in order to make sure everybody would be able to listen, they designed the architecture that echoes, but without repetition. You know, it echoes. You know, it transfers the sound without any repetition in the echoing, that everyone, even in the back, very, very far back, can hear. So some people, and there's a very specific spot under the dome that echoes. And then if you go there, and then if you talk, I don't know, tens of meters away on the other side, they can't even see you, they can hear you. And some people go in there, you can do this, you can go and rub your hands. And if people are quiet, everybody can hear that. So these, some people even do it with, and then they film themselves and put it on YouTube. They do it with money notes, to show how effective it is. There was a public bath, was getting the gas from the public sewage, and using that as a permanent source of energy to warm up the water, until it was broken. So these are there hundreds, maybe more, in that city. So they catch the wind, and they transfer the wind into the house, and there's a bit of a water, and then through that it cools down, etc., etc. So the reason I'm sharing this is because that knowledge you see is not produced. The knowledge of how to build this is not produced through private companies of the time inventing that. It was communal knowledge. And as the result of that communal knowledge, you see that uh, when things are in commons, they don't go against the environment. They find ways of living in balance as much as possible, because no one is seeking profit against the interest of others. They're not in relentless competition, profit motive, etc., etc. So this is an interesting one. I thought maybe that would interest you. This one, yes, this one is the New Zealand river movement that they gave a personal right to the river. You know, we do that to the companies. That's why McDonald's can, as the lady says, they can sue you, and you can sue McDonald's. Not just the boss, the company. So the company is treated legally as a person. Now, why not doing that to rivers, mountains, forests, bushes, etc., etc. So there is a movement for doing that, and so this legalization or personalization, or giving personal legal rights to nature is part of the reification, de-fetishization, and gaining control, which means reclaiming. So those elements, you can find that in there. These are very interesting ones. The landless workers, as I mentioned in the slide, the landless workers of Brazil, they also take unused land, and then they build cooperatives, they build houses, community houses, public houses, etc., etc. Sometimes those abandoned, financially broken companies or factories are taken back by the workers who used to be working there, and they put you back to working, and they look after themselves. So yes, if you like, we can watch one of them, or do you want? Yeah, okay. I think it would be a better way of using our time instead of going through those slides. Those slides are there. You can just Google the examples in there, and when you write your answer to the second question, again, yeah, just to start with talking about what we mean, just in one sentence, what it means to say decommonization or and recommonization, and then use the example of land. You have a lot of slides there and examples there, and then this is the reification aspect of it. This is the fetishizing aspect of it. This is the appropriation aspect of it, and then in the second part of your answer to the second question, you talk about the opposite side. This is the reclaiming aspect of it, and here are the examples, and you can Google and find those examples in the slides. Here is the de-reification, and here is the de-fetishization, etc., etc., and then finished it. A little bit of a conclusive statement might be nice in the end. Again, I can't just tell you put 50 words for each or whatever. Just do it and then come back and polish it, and then make sure that you're within the limits.
I'm here today as a guest on land that was stolen from the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, land that many other tribal nations thought of as home before those relationships were written over by settler colonialism. So land acknowledgements like this have become pretty commonplace at the beginning of events, at universities, sometimes in our email signatures, but I've always found them to be kind of confusing. Like, once you admit something is stolen, aren't you supposed to give it back? So if there's anyone listening who has a couple hundred spare acres that you're feeling guilty about, just contact your local tribal government. We would be happy to relieve you of that burden. That's probably not you, right? Maybe you've heard of this movement to return land to indigenous people, but you're thinking, I can barely afford rent. What is it I'm supposed to be giving back? That's what I want to clarify today. Because not only is getting land back in indigenous hands in your best interests, and the best interests of the land itself, there's ways anyone can help make it happen. I'm a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, which is part of the Anishinaabe Nation of the Great Lakes region. Home, for me, is also the Pacific Northwest. I grew up on Kalapuya and Molalla territory, and now I'm a professor of Indigenous Studies at CSU. My ancestors worked very hard to navigate a complex and changing world that was ravaged by settler colonialism. My grandma and both of her parents survived the trauma and abuse of the Indian boarding school system. The generation before them fought to keep our tribe from being terminated by the federal government. Going even further back, my 6 times great-grandfather's signature is on the 1863 Treaty of Old Crossing, which forced the Anishinaabe to give up 11 million acres of what's now Minnesota in exchange for a little over $400,000 and a 640-acre reservation. That works out to about 5 cents an acre, which has to be one of the worst land deals in US history. Or maybe the best, depending on who you ask. This sort of thing happened all over the US and Canada. And the problem isn't just that settlers showed up and took the land. It's how they've treated it ever since. That land we lost in Minnesota, the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline goes right through the middle of it. That freaking pipeline is responsible for the largest inland oil spill ever recorded in the US. And now, they're trying to expand it. Whether we're talking pipelines or some other industry, the colonial mindset has been about extracting resources, mostly with the goal of making the rich richer. But that's why land back is not about indigenous people trying to run a real estate scam. We're doing this because the land itself is in crisis. Every indigenous culture is unique, but our shared philosophy is that we come from the land and the land is what sustains us. And therefore, we have a responsibility to care for it. Land back is about reasserting indigenous relationships with the land. Relationships that are based on tens of thousands of years of hands-on experience taking care of our homelands. If you've ever tried your hand at farming or gardening, you know that land management takes more than just showing up with good intentions. Globally, indigenous people are really good at managing for biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. That's because we've had generation upon generation to test out what works and what doesn't. There's tons of evidence and examples to back this up. One recent study showed that indigenous people make up just 5% of the global population, but we're managing nearly half the areas on Earth that are protected for conservation or still support intact ecosystems. In the United States, tribal nations have reintroduced endangered species, even when the government said it wouldn't work. So in the Northwest, where I grew up, most of the big rivers have been dammed, which makes it super hard for salmon to survive, and many runs have gone extinct. So back in the 90s, the Nimipu people told the state of Idaho, hey, we'd like to bring coho salmon back to the Snake River. The state fish and wildlife guys were like, I don't think so. But the tribe did it anyway. They got eggs that one of the hatcheries was gonna throw away, incubated them, and basically snuck the fish back into the river. And now they're doing so well that the state has reopened the sport fishery, and the tribe is reintroducing coho to a bunch of other rivers. Same thing with buffalo. Back in the 1800s, when the railroads were going in and Native people were literally being kicked off the land at gunpoint, buffalo were nearly exterminated because they thought that would make it easier to subdue the tribes who depended on them. So get this, most of the buffalo that you see today in zoos or wildlife reserves are actually descended from conservation herds that Native people protected back then. And now, the Blackfeet Nation is bringing free-ranging buffalo back to their homeland in Montana. We're also pretty good at cleaning up the ecological messes caused by colonialism. The town of Eureka, California was like, okay, we're ready to give some land back. We know it's culturally a really important place to you. Oh, and by the way, it's a Superfund site, so it's hella polluted. Good luck with that. And the Wyatt tribe said, great, we'll take it. And now they're in the process of successfully remediating the site. They've removed tons of trash and contaminated soil. They're working on erosion control and wildlife habitat and making it a place where they can hold ceremonies again. The land is better off in indigenous hands because we treat the land like it's a relative. Even our youth know how this works. So I run a summer camp for Native kids where we talk about indigenous science and how we relate to the land. So last summer, after the camp wraps up, Henry's mom calls me. He's one of the campers, he's 6. And she says he's had a falling out with his best friend. They were playing outside and the friend, who's not Native, was squishing grasshoppers for fun. Henry tried to stop him and the friend said, they're just bugs, it doesn't matter. But Henry told him, they're not just bugs, they're our relatives, and you can't kill them. So that was the summer I had to learn how to keep grasshoppers from eating my garden with garlic spray, because every time I went to use pesticides or something that would kill them, I thought of Henry and what kind of future we might have if we actually lived like that. Land back is about radically rethinking how we relate to the land and other living beings. So, look up whose land you're on. Some tribes, like the Ohlone and Duwamish, have a way for you to pay a voluntary land tax on their website as a way to recognize that you're a guest on their homeland. Way easier than dealing with the IRS. Or maybe you do own land, but you need to live there for now. You can set up a bequest in your will so that your estate goes back to the tribe. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. Unsettling is hard work, especially in places where indigenous people were removed or erased. That absence tends to be papered over with the myth that colonialism worked, Native people disappeared, so there's nothing to worry about. But when I look at my own family's history, the government that took our land and outlawed our ceremonies, the boarding schools that took our language, the epidemic of sexual violence that has touched nearly every Native woman in my family. All of these concerted efforts to end the story of us as Anishinaabe people. And yet, despite all that, we're still here. Our survival as Indigenous people is a miracle. And the point of miracles is that they inspire action. I think if we're honest, as human beings, we know that this path we're on is both morally untenable and ecologically unsustainable. Land back is a call to action. To get real that the current system is only really working for an increasingly smaller group of folks. But when the people who are benefiting from this legacy of stolen land step forward, real change can happen. This isn't just an opportunity to right a past injustice, it's the only way to heal the land itself. And that means a better future for everyone. Thank you.
Okay. What do you think? Any comments, questions? Is everything kind of clear about the topic and different aspects? Oh, something else. Unfortunately, I have to cancel next week because it coincides with an interview that I have to go. There are about 10 people that I asked them to see if they can find another timing to schedule, but it's hard to find that would work for 10 people. So, and it coincides with this. So what I'm doing is that, so next week we're not unfortunately going to have that. So, but I will do a bit of a pre-recording of the lecture and I will post it online for you. So you can stay at home or spending your time at a cafe might be more productive than coming. And then, yeah. And then the assignment would be due next week, right? So if again you have any questions, let me know by email, private conversation through Zoom or phone call. Yeah, or send me a draft, the first draft. I'm happy to have a look at the first draft and give you some general comments. You don't need to copy and paste the questions. You just put your, you can say answer to first question and then you put your answer and then answer to the second question. This way we can reduce the similarity index, because if we just keep repeating the assignments, instructions, and questions, I might increase the index. But that's okay. I'm not going to pay too much attention to the index that is caused by that. Yeah. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. All the best. See you week after. Oh, is that the week after also mid-semester break? No. That would be after that. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Goodbye.